As we saw last lesson, this poem, Catrin, has conflict at its heart. It questions and presents quite surprising images of what it means to be a mother of a child. And we're going to continue reading this, and we're going to look at the second half of the poem. So make sure you've got a pen and paper ready. Make sure you can see your poem, because I'm going to want you to write annotations as we go along. This lesson we're going to consider the second half of the poem, looking at that in a little bit more detail, just like we did for the first half. Hopefully we will then be able to identify some of those important ideas and themes that are explored in the whole poem. We've looked at the ones introduced in the first half, and let's see how they develop. We're going to explore some of the techniques that Gillian Clarke uses in order to draw out some of those ideas. So we're just going to kind of have a look at how she plays with language a little bit. Hopefully then we'll be able to evaluate the speaker's feelings, evaluate how she feels about her role within this relationship, and then we're going to consider our own response to the big ideas in this poem. So hopefully this poem will make you feel something and will make you question certain ideas, and will make you explore your own opinions perhaps. That's what good poetry should do. So that's hopefully where we'll get to at the end. And this is all preparation for you to have a go next lesson at writing your own poem using one of the techniques that Gillian Clarke has used in this poem. So I'm going to ask you to think about your own sort of strong feelings and emotions and see if you can write a poem that uses imagery in a similar way. So I'm quite excited about that, and let's get going. You will remember that in the last series of lessons, Mrs. Elliot introduced you to Amity, which is the sort of tool that we use to approach unseen poetry and to begin to make sense of these kind of very dense, rich passages of text. We ask ourselves about what is the poem about by asking all sorts of basic questions like what's happening, who's speaking, when and where, all those things. We look at the mood and we look at how the mood shifts and changes. We consider the big ideas that the poet is trying to explore in this poem, and then we look at the techniques that he or she uses in order to explore those ideas or to evoke certain images and moods in the poem. And we always finish with your response. You know, what has this poem made you feel? What about the big ideas that are presented to us, and what perhaps has it prompted you to ask about the world around you and perhaps your relationship with that world around you. Now today I want you to keep those ideas front of mind. We're going to be looking at where the mood and the ideas shift, but we're particularly focusing on ideas and techniques before we move to your response. I read the poem to you last lesson, but it's always worth reading the poem in full each time you come to it afresh. Each time you read it again, the poem will gradually release some of its layers of meanings to you and will begin to make a little bit more sense. As I read you the whole poem again now, I'd like you to think about what happens between stanza 1 and stanza 2. So stanza 2 is the stanza that starts neither won or lost the struggle. So I'm going to read the whole thing. Work out what has happened. What shift has there been between those two stanzas? Catrin. I can remember you, child, as I stood in a hot white room at the window watching the people and cars taking turn at the traffic lights. I can remember you, our first fierce confrontation, the tight red rope of love which we both fought over. It was square, environmental blank, disinfected of paintings or toys. I wrote all over the walls with my words, coloured the clean squares with the wild, tendered circles of our struggle to become separate. We want, we shouted, to be two, to be ourselves. Neither won nor lost the struggle in the glass tank, clouded with feelings which changed us both. Still I am fighting you off, as you stand there with your straight, strong, long brown hair and your rosy, defiant glare, bringing up from the heart's pool that old rope, tightening about my life, training love and conflict, as you ask, may you skate in the dark for one more hour. So you'll often be asked to talk about structure, the structure of a poem. Now, the structure is simply the building blocks of a poem, how the story of the poem unfolds, what happens first and then next, and then what happens finally, how we learn the full narrative. The structure includes moments of shifts and changes in mood, time, setting, or perspective. It may perhaps be seen from somebody else's perspective. Structure also may relate to repeated ideas or images that are returned to again and again. So I asked you that question, what has happened since the first stanza? What has changed? Is this still a baby? As you can see here, I've highlighted some of the key images that the poet has introduced or returned to in this stanza. But to be honest, I could have highlighted most of it. There's so much in here that relates to the feelings of the speaker. Now, what I'd like you to do, looking at this, is to find evidence that might suggest a number of different things, different perhaps conflicting feelings that the speaker expresses. So the first one I'm going to ask you to try and find is evidence that might suggest the speaker finds her relationship with her daughter difficult. So think about individual words or perhaps short phrases that suggest that the speaker might find the relationship with her daughter difficult. Then I'd like you to try and find evidence which might suggest that she is proud of her daughter. Any descriptions of her daughter which show a warmth and perhaps that show a pride in her daughter. Something that shows that she is proud of her daughter. And then finally, I just want you to see if you can find some evidence in this stanza that shows warm feelings, warm, affectionate feelings from the speaker towards her daughter. Now, there are a number of each, and you may need to explain why. I'm looking for single words or short phrases, perhaps a note or two explaining why you think this. But if you can add those to your form now, that would be great. This poem, like so many poems, is absolutely littered with metaphors. Gillian Clark has used an awful lot. Now, a metaphor, as you'll remember from last lesson, is a literary device in which one thing is described as if it were something else. Now, we're going to look at a number of these different metaphors, and we're going to try and understand what they might be metaphors for, what they're trying to kind of stand in for or represent, and the layers of meanings, the different ways that we might be able to interpret them. And what I want you to understand about poetry and about metaphors within poetry is that they are what we might call writerly texts. There are two different sorts of text. There's a readerly text, which is a straightforward text that we read and interpret and understand straight away. Usually instructions, recipes, that sort of thing. Writerly texts are ones that require us to do some sort of work, to become like writers, to interpret and understand and make inferences. And poetry is absolutely a rich writerly text, and this is no different here. So the first metaphor that I want you to look at is the first one in the second stanza. Neither won or lost the struggle. In this case, neither refers to the mother and the daughter. So I want to ask you, what is the metaphor? And what does the poet's use of that metaphor suggest about the relationship between the mother and the daughter in this case? So in that short phrase there, neither won nor lost the struggle, what is the metaphor? What is the one thing that is standing in for something else? What could you take out and replace with another word? This next metaphor follows on immediately from the previous one. Neither won nor lost the struggle in the glass tank clouded with feelings which changed us both. So this metaphor I'm going to give you, it's the glass tank. Now the glass tank is a metaphor for something. What is it a metaphor for? They may be the same thing. Okay, this glass tank is a metaphor for something to do with the mother and the daughter. Now, I want you, in order to understand what this might suggest about the speaker's feelings about her relationship with her daughter, you need to understand a little bit about what a glass tank is and think about what it might be like to be in a glass tank, and what your relationship perhaps would be with the person who is in the glass tank with you and with people looking in from the outside. And then consider what it means to be in a glass tank that is clouded with feelings. If something is clouded, it becomes unclear and uncertain. What is this poet potentially, what is she maybe saying about the relationship between this speaker and her daughter? What might she be suggesting about it? And why does the metaphor of the glass tank enable her to do that? I hope when you look at this slide you will see an image that you recognise, and I hope when you read the quote in the orange box you will see something that reminds you of a metaphor that we saw in stanza 1. That old rope tightening about my life, trailing love and conflict. So I'm going to ask you again the same question, what is the metaphor? But you're going to have to look back at stanza 1 to really understand it. And when you look back at it in stanza 1, you're going to have to look at its layers of meaning. It had a literal meaning and then it had a metaphorical meaning. And this extended metaphor here looks at that secondary meaning. The writer has extended it by adding details to it, and she is suggesting something more about the relationship between the mother and the daughter. Now I want you to think about this, and I want you to think back to that initial metaphor that we had in stanza 1 that was both positive and negative, that had different ways of interpreting it. And I want you to see what this might suggest now it's been extended about the relationship between the mother and the daughter. Is it clearer, or is it still both positive and negative? In order to be able to describe these conflicting feelings, these positive and negative feelings that are felt at the same time, we need a word. And this is one of my favourite words to use when I talk about poetry, because poetry is rarely simple, and it is rarely something that allows us a clear single point of view. So we need a word like ambivalence, and it's one of my favourites. Ambivalence comes from a Latin root meaning ambi, both or both sides. Think about ambidextrous. People who are ambidextrous can use both their left and their right hands. And valenti, which means strength. So it means literally something that is a strong pull in both directions, on both sides. So the meaning of ambivalence is simultaneous conflicting feelings. So feelings that we feel at the same time that contradict with one another, that fight against one another. And can we see how ambivalence is a really good way of describing the relationship that the speaker seems to have with her daughter, and also her feelings about being a mother in the first place. She feels ambivalent, that is the adjective. So she feels ambivalent about her role as a parent. You will see if you go back to the Google form now that the penultimate question is, or task is, that I want you to use the word either ambivalence or ambivalent to describe the speaker's feeling about being a mother. I've given you a couple of sentence starters here because it's quite hard to use a new word, and I want you to kind of practice playing about with it. So you could either say something like, the speaker seems to feel ambivalent about her role as a mother because, give us a little bit of evidence and tell us why you think she feels that. Or you could say something like, the speaker expresses or conveys ambivalence about what it means to be a mother when, and you could tell us when you see that. So you could either use the adjective ambivalent or the noun ambivalence, but I want you to use one of those to describe that conflicting sense of emotions that fight against one another within the speaker here. So see if you can do that in your Google form now. The final thing we're going to do this lesson is just to really try and sum up our own thoughts. So this is the your response section of Amity that we always kind of come back to. And I want to ask you what this poem has made you feel about the relationships generally between parents or carers and young people, and what questions it has prompted you to ask about yourself as a child growing up, no longer a dependent baby, but somebody struggling for their own different identity that is separate from their parents. So in just a few sentences, sum up your feelings about this poem and what questions it has prompted you to ask yourself as a result of reading it.